My best friend secretly dated my ex-husband, asked me to be maid of honor after betraying me. The champagne flute slipped from my hand and shattered against the hardwood floor of Rosemary's Bistro, our usual Thursday night spot. Katie was beaming at me across the table, her left hand extended to show off a modest but elegant solitaire diamond that caught the restaurant's warm lighting. She'd been talking for 10 minutes about meeting someone special, about how love finds you when you least expect it, about wanting me to be her maid of honor because I was her closest friend, and she couldn't imagine getting married without me. There. The irony tasted bitter in my mouth, mixing with the residual wine I'd been nursing all evening. Katie had been my emotional lifeline through the divorce proceedings. Every Thursday for 6 months, we'd sat in this exact booth while I dissected every frustrating interaction with Brad, every mediation session, every moment of doubt about whether I was making the right choice. She'd listened to me question everything about our 7-year marriage, holding my hand when I signed papers and buying me margaritas when the decree became final. Now she was sitting across from me, practically glowing with happiness, talking about fall weddings and honeymoon destinations while I tried to process what felt like an emotional ambush. She kept mentioning how different this relationship felt, how her mystery fiancé understood her in ways no one else ever had, how he'd helped her realize what real partnership looked like. The timing felt wrong somehow. 6 months seemed too convenient, too neat. The waitress appeared with a broom to clean up my mess, shooting me a concerned look. Katie barely noticed, too lost in her own joy to register my growing unease. She kept talking about wedding venues and color schemes, about how she'd always dreamed of an intimate ceremony with just close friends and family. The words washed over me like static as I tried to understand why this conversation felt more like an interrogation than a celebration. Something in Katie's demeanor had shifted over the past few weeks. She'd been asking fewer questions about my post-divorce adjustment and more about Brad specifically, how he was handling the split, whether he seemed happier, if I thought he was dating anyone. I'd attributed her curiosity to genuine concern for both of us, but now those conversations took on a different weight in my memory. Updated. Hey everyone, thanks for reading along. I know this setup sounds familiar, but trust me, the betrayal goes deeper than you think. Something about Katie's excitement felt performative, like she was trying too hard to gauge my reaction. Have you ever had a friend whose good news felt like bad news in disguise? Katie and I had been friends since college at UCLA, bonding over late-night study sessions in the library and a shared obsession with reality TV. She was the extroverted yang to my introverted yin, the one who dragged me to parties, encouraged me to join clubs, and later pushed me to give online dating a chance after a particularly brutal breakup junior year. She'd actually been the one to suggest I might like Brad when we met him at a mutual friend's barbecue 3 years after graduation. He was charming in that confident but not cocky way that made you feel chosen when he focused his attention on you. Katie had nudged me toward him that night, pointing out how he kept looking in my direction and suggesting I go talk to him about the book he was reading. Their friendship had been casual but consistent. They moved in the same professional circles in downtown San Diego, occasionally grabbing coffee or attending the same networking events. During my marriage, Katie had been a fixture in our social life without being intrusive. She joined us for game nights and birthday dinners, but she also maintained her own separate friendship with both of us. When Brad and I started having problems in year 5, I naturally turned to Katie for perspective. She'd listen to my complaints about his increasing emotional distance and offer balanced advice that never felt like she was taking sides. The real issues in our marriage had been subtle but persistent. Brad wasn't abusive or cruel. He was just increasingly absent, even when he was physically present. He'd stopped asking about my day, stopped planning date nights, stopped engaging in the small daily conversations that keep a relationship alive. When I'd bring up my concerns, he'd acknowledge them, but nothing would change. We'd settled into a comfortable but hollow routine that felt more like roommates than spouses. The divorce process had been surprisingly civil. We'd used a mediator instead of lawyers, split our assets fairly, and managed to avoid the bitter fights that destroy some couples. Brad had seemed almost relieved when I finally brought up separation, like he'd been waiting for someone to acknowledge what we both knew but neither wanted to say. The whole thing took 8 months from initial conversation to final decree. Throughout those 8 months, Katie had been exactly the friend I needed. She helped me research divorce mediators, brought me takeout when I was too stressed to cook, and provided a listening ear whenever I needed to process my feelings. Our Thursday dinners at Rosemary's became sacred, a weekly check-in where I could vent, cry, or just sit in comfortable silence with someone who understood what I was going through. Katie never pushed me to reconcile with Brad, but she also never badmouthed him, maintaining a careful neutrality that I appreciated. The revelation didn't come from Katie's confession. It came from my own horrified recognition as she continued describing her romance. Her mystery man had taken her hiking at Torrey Pines, the same trail where Brad and I had gotten engaged 4 years earlier. He'd surprised her with tickets to see Radiohead, a band she'd never shown interest in, but that I'd dragged Brad to see twice. He'd started cooking dinner more often and had become surprisingly good at meal planning, skills I'd begged Brad to develop throughout our entire marriage. Every detail felt like a puzzle piece clicking into place. The way she described their first real conversation at a coffee shop downtown where they'd talked for hours about relationships and what they wanted in a partner, how he'd been hesitant to start something new because he was coming out of a complicated situation, but felt drawn to her anyway. The gradual way their friendship had deepened into something more, built on late-night phone calls and shared insights about what makes relationships work. I sat frozen as Katie painted a picture of romance that sounded disturbingly familiar, like someone had taken the blueprint of my failed marriage and created a successful relationship from its negative space. When she mentioned how thoughtful her fiancé was about remembering important dates, how he'd learned to express his emotions better through working on himself, how he'd become more present and communicative than he'd ever been in previous relationships, the pieces finally clicked. The man she was describing wasn't just any man. It was a better version of Brad. The Brad I'd tried to help him become, using strategies and insights Katie had witnessed during our Thursday therapy sessions disguised as dinner conversations. She'd been cataloging my complaints and frustrations, not to help me process them, but to create a roadmap for someone else. When I finally found my voice, I asked her point blank about the timing. When had they first started talking? How long? Had they been friends before it became romantic? Katie's answers were carefully vague, full of phrases like, "It's hard to pinpoint exactly," and "things developed naturally over time." But when pressed for specifics, she admitted they'd reconnected. About 6 months ago when he'd reached out asking for advice about helping someone through a difficult transition. The conversation that followed was surreal. Katie seemed genuinely surprised by my lack of enthusiasm, explaining that she'd hoped I'd be happy for her, because I knew better than anyone how rare it was to find real compatibility. She wanted my blessing because my opinion mattered to her, because I'd been through the trenches of a relationship with this person and could appreciate how much he'd grown. She actually used the phrase, "You helped make him into the man he is today," as if I should be grateful for the opportunity to see my emotional labor benefit someone else. The most insulting part was her continued insistence that I be her maid of honor. She'd already started planning, had venues in mind, and wanted to know if I'd be free for dress shopping the following weekend. She seemed genuinely confused by my silence, interpreting it as shock rather than horror. When I finally asked her to say his name out loud, to stop referring to her fiancé in the abstract, she hesitated for just a moment too long before admitting it was Brad. Updated. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal. It was the realization that she genuinely thought I'd be excited for them. 6 months of using my pain as relationship, coaching, and she expected me to celebrate the results. I'm still processing how someone could be this tone-deaf. Do you think she knew how cruel this was? Or was she really that delusional? I left Rosemary's without saying another word. Katie called after me, her voice carrying genuine confusion and what sounded like hurt, as if my reaction was unfair to her. She'd clearly scripted this conversation differently in her head, probably imagining tears of joy and enthusiastic wedding planning, rather than stunned silence and a hasty exit. The drive home felt like moving through molasses, every familiar street and landmark taking on new meaning as I processed the scope of what had happened. 20 years of friendship, reduced to rubble in the span of a single dinner conversation. I kept replaying moments from our recent Thursday meetings, seeing them through this new lens of manipulation. Katie's intense interest in my healing process, her specific questions about what I needed from a partner, her suggestions about focusing on my own growth rather than dwelling on Brad's failures. It had all been reconnaissance. My phone started, buzzing before I even got home. Long texts from Katie explaining how sorry she was that I'd found out this way, how much our friendship meant to her, how she'd never intended for things to develop the way they had. She swore that her feelings for Brad had caught her completely off guard, that she'd tried to suppress them out of loyalty to me, that they'd both struggled with the ethical implications before deciding that love was worth the risk. The messages evolved throughout the evening, cycling through different emotional strategies. Apologies gave way to justifications, reminders that my marriage had been unhappy, assertions that she was giving Brad something I never could, suggestions that this might actually free me to find someone more compatible. When those didn't get responses, came the guilt trips. References to our shared history, appeals to my capacity for forgiveness, emotional manipulation wrapped in the language of vulnerability. I didn't respond to any of it. Instead, I started reaching out to our mutual friends, the people who'd been part of our social ecosystem for years. I needed them to hear my version before Katie had a chance to frame the narrative. The conversations were awkward but necessary. Most people expressed appropriate shock and outrage, though a few admitted they'd noticed Katie acting differently in recent months, being secretive about her whereabouts, declining group invitations, asking unusual questions about relationships, and forgiveness. The most validating call was with Jessica, a friend from our college days who'd remained close to both of us. She revealed that Katie had been increasingly distant from their friend group, often canceling plans last minute or seeming distracted when she did show up. Jessica had assumed Katie was going through some kind of personal crisis, but now everything made sense. She was furious on my behalf and immediately started spreading the word through our extended network. Within a week, the social fallout was evident. Katie found herself excluded from group chats and uninvited from events she'd normally attend. The book club we'd both belonged to for 3 years suddenly had scheduling conflicts whenever she tried to participate. Brad fared even worse. His reputation among our mutual friends, already somewhat tarnished by our divorce, was now completely destroyed. The narrative that emerged wasn't just about infidelity, but about calculated emotional manipulation and profound betrayal of trust. 8 months later, I heard through mutual friends that Katie and Brad's engagement had ended. The details were fuzzy, but apparently the romance that had seemed so perfect in its early stages couldn't survive the reality of daily life together. All of Brad's old patterns had resurfaced. The emotional unavailability, the communication issues, the tendency to check out when things got difficult. Katie discovered that having insider knowledge about someone's relationship problems doesn't automatically solve those problems in your own relationship. The irony was both beautiful and sad. Katie had convinced herself that she could succeed where I'd failed by simply avoiding my mistakes. But she'd never understood that the issues in my marriage weren't tactical errors that could be corrected with better strategy. They were fundamental incompatibilities that no amount of preparation could overcome. She'd studied the symptoms without understanding the disease. My own life has taken unexpected turns that I'm still processing. The betrayal that felt like the end of everything turned out to be the catalyst for genuine self-reflection and growth. I started therapy, not to process the divorce, but to understand why I'd accepted emotional unavailability for so long. I joined a hiking group, tried pottery classes, and even started dating again, cautiously, but with a much clearer sense of what I actually want in a partner. The most surprising development has been the peace I've found in solitude. For the first time in my adult life, I'm not trying to fix a relationship or maintain a friendship that requires constant emotional labor. I wake up on Saturday mornings and make plans based entirely on what sounds appealing to me, without considering anyone else's needs or expectations. It's a kind of freedom I didn't know I was missing. I occasionally see Katie around town. San Diego's social circles overlap in inevitable ways. She always looks like she wants to approach me, to attempt some kind of reconciliation or explanation, but there's nothing left to discuss. Some betrayals reveal fundamental character flaws that can't be explained away with apologies or circumstances. The woman who could systematically use my pain to build someone else's happiness isn't someone I can trust with my friendship, regardless of our history. Looking back, I realized that Katie's betrayal was devastating, but also clarifying. It freed me from a marriage that was slowly eroding my sense of self and a friendship that was apparently more conditional than I'd understood. More importantly, it taught me to value my own judgment and emotional well-being enough to walk away from people who don't deserve access to my inner life. Updated. It's been over a year since that dinner at Rosemary's, and I'm genuinely at peace with how everything unfolded. Katie and Brad both learned that building a relationship on manipulation and betrayal creates a foundation too weak to support real intimacy. I've learned to trust my instincts and protect my energy more carefully. For those who've experienced similar betrayals, would you have been able to forgive a friend who used your pain as a playbook for their own happiness?